This is week 2 of our theme of celebrating God and praising God. And we don't have a title at all for this week. It's Praising in Dance. And our Bible reading comes from 2 Samuel chapter 6, a passage that has always brought some controversy about the whole idea of dance and worship. And I'm going to read some of it. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all the men went to Baale in Judea to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of God on a cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. Wearing a fine, this is going to verse 14 now, wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of trumpet. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of David, Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. This passage, of course, talks about David dancing before the Lord, and there's a lot of talk about how appropriate or inappropriate dance is in worship today, but I'm not altogether sure that is the key message of this passage. David has gone to fetch the Ark of the Covenant back from where it had been captured, and so they take along a new cart and they put the ark on the cart and they begin to bring it towards Jerusalem. If you know the story well, you'll know in some of the verses that I missed out, the ark went to fall off the cart, and one of the men with it reached out to steady it and stop it falling off, and he was killed instantly because it broke God's rules for him to touch it. Really quite an interesting debate about the holiness of God and how we as humans cannot touch or approach him like that. But the other fact is, of course, that David ignored the rules about how to carry the ark, because the ark would have been top heavy and should have been carried on poles. That enabled people to not be near it to touch it and made it more stable, but maybe a little more difficult than moving it on wheels, because they would have had to have carried the whole weight. We don't really know quite what David was thinking, why he used a cart, but it's about taking God at his word. So the ark then remained somewhere for 3 months, and then David went to try and get the ark back today to bring it to Jerusalem. As he comes up towards Jerusalem, David is just overjoyed about bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. So he danced before the Lord. Now, this is David, just his praise of God and his worship of God just overflowing into action. When we talk about our worship of God overflowing into action, often we begin to think about doing good deeds or those sorts of things. But actually for David, it's in physical worship of dance. Of course, one of the contested parts of this Bible and passage is that David wore a linen ephod. And some people want to say, well, that was a disrespectful way of dressing. But actually, it was an upper body covering of the clothing that was traditionally worn by the priests. So when we see Michal, his wife, looking out at him and not liking what she sees, it might well be something to do, not only because of his dancing, he's making an exhibit of himself, but because he's dressing up as a priest. Before David, there was a very clear distinction between the prophet, the priest, and the king, really. And David is beginning to blur some of those lines which were finally, of course, blurred in Jesus. So David danced before the Lord in all his might, and his wife, and we can only suppose some of the other people, didn't like it. Dancing in the time of David, women often danced to celebrate the return of Saul's army after a successful campaign against the Philistines. Dancing also has a negative connotation in the book of Exodus, but David's dancing before the Lord seems to be quite acceptable to God. So all of Israel joined with David, and they shouted and they danced and they celebrated the fact that the ark had come back. Meanwhile, some people, like David's wife, grumbled about how inappropriate it was. And then, taking on the priestly role even further, at the end of the passage, David blesses the people. David again taking on that priestly role of bringing God's blessing to the people. I'm sure David was really excited to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. At first he got it wrong because he didn't follow God's laid down rules in his word about how the ark was to be carried, and not following God's rules led to a disaster in that it fell over and somebody lost their life for it. The second time, of course, David decided he would follow God's rule, and that was a successful outcome. And David's worship for God was wholeheartedly out there. He's singing, he's dancing, he celebrated God and God's goodness in what God was doing in his time. I hope we can think a little bit about what that means for us today, how we feel about dancing in worship today will no doubt prompt an interesting discussion.